Hi, everyone, and welcome. It's so great to see such a spectrum of people attending today. We have project managers, we have product managers, HR and people ops professionals, Scrum Masters, software engineers, VPs of technology. My name is Candance Giesbrecht, and I'm the director of the Remote Performance Academy at Teamit.com, where we recruit, cultivate, and sustain high-performing distributed technical teams. I recently decided to pursue certification as an Agile People Ops coach. This is a new program and I'm just loving it. But as part of my coursework, I was required to watch a keynote that Mary Poppendieck gave at an Agile conference a few years ago. I was 10 minutes into the keynote and I hit pause to run and get a notepad because I was like, oh my goodness, I need to take notes on this. I watched, I rewatched, I shared it with a bunch of key people, and then I pinged Mary and Tom and said, thank you for your thought leadership. Thank you for all that you have contributed to all of our learning. And I asked if they would agree to be interviewed by us. And we're here today because they said yes. So thank you for saying yes, Mary and Tom. Agile and Lean methodologies revolutionized manufacturing and IT. Is it possible that they can do the same for the post-pandemic workplace? How might a lean mindset help us create a comprehensive approach to the workplace of the future that encompasses strategy, structure, people, process, and technology? Mary and Tom are Agile pioneers, renowned speakers, and educators in the software development world. They're co-authors of several books related to Agile and Lean, including their award-winning books, Lean Software Development and Agile Toolkit, and the Lean Mindset, Ask the Right Questions. To help us with our conversation today, Michael Loughlean, Associate Director at Accenture, and Alistair Shepherd-Cross, Teamit's President and co-founder. They're going to help guide this conversation because I'm still such a newbie to this learning. And they're going to help us get insights and perspectives from Tom and Mary on how lean and agile methodologies can begin to address the changes we're seeing in the workplaces around the world. Welcome, everyone. And Alistair, I'm going to turn it right over to you to get us started.
Great. Well, welcome, everybody. And Mary and Tom, thanks so much for agreeing to do this. It's a pleasure to have you here and share your huge knowledge on the subject. And just to let everyone know, there's construction going on in the house next door today. Welcome to the world of distributed work. So if there's any loud bangs, that's what's going on. So I'll just wanted to make sure that
next week we get a new roof. So fortunately,
right, exactly. Well, we'll jump right in here. So my question to you is, when we talk to our clients, one of the biggest challenges they are currently experiencing is their ability to attract and retain talent. That's a huge issue. And the seismic shift in the workplace to a more distributed model continues to change the recruitment landscape. So my question to you is, how could adopting lean and agile methodologies give companies a competitive edge and help them win the talent war?
Okay, so let's not say adopting technologies is going to help recruit people, because I don't think it will. But if you think about how people react and what they enjoy a challenge, and they enjoy the expectation that they will pursue the challenge and make progress and have success. And so you need to create an environment in which people are challenged and can make progress towards interesting goals that they care about and have success in doing that. And when you can create that kind of an environment, then you should be able to attract and retain people. You have to treat them like adults, not like children. Too many of our methodologies are too strict in treating and end up treating, even though they're not supposed to, they end up treating most of the people like children. And you don't have to talk to too many software engineers to find them people who are totally frustrated with the textbook mechanisms that agile methodologies put in front of them and don't allow them to think and be challenged and understand what it is that they're trying to do and make contributions to the world. But things that motivate people have to do with being able to be good at something, be really a master, be challenged by something, be successful in contributing not just to myself, but to the overall world, and have colleagues that I really enjoy working with. So you're not going to get the colleagues part unless you get, a few good ones to start with. So let's skip that part. But one of the problems that we see a lot of is that the methodologies that have come in the last year, they've done interesting things, but what they have oftentimes done, which you really have to be careful about, is they've created too much of a unchallenging environment, too much of a give people small tasks and check up on them every day and that sort of thing. So we have to get away from that. I think the part about Agile that is good is already table stakes, okay? And the part of Agile that is not good is way too often what's being emphasized. So if you take a look at where I learned how to do software, it was an engineering department. And I did process controls for big roll good processes. I actually never worked in IT. I worked in mostly what would today be called engineering software, or it would be called embedded software. Of course, our computers were like way too big to embed, but it's the same sort of control system software. So I was an engineer by title, not by, I didn't have a professional engineering license. I was a math and physics major in college, not an engineer. But I was in engineering departments and treated like an engineer. And I have this feeling of how it is to be treated like a competent engineer. And if you think about engineers and how you would treat competent engineers, that's when you have a company where people love to come into work and do the whatever kind of engineering it is that they're working on, whether it's structural evaluation or designing new houses or stuff like that. I have a son, one of my granddaughter's boyfriends, okay, potential grandson-in-law, got it, who is a civil engineer, and he designs solar systems. And he designs it as part of an engineering firm. And some of the Agile technologies that we have would be insulting in that engineering firm. He learns under the guidance of senior folks, including his boss, who's a very good engineer, who he really respects and who really want him to grow into a competent senior engineer himself. And we need to figure out, are we treating people like that, where they love to go to work during the day because they have challenging stuff, people who appreciate them, people who turn them loose on interesting problems. I remember when I was doing software, I was just pretty much turned loose on interesting problems. And it was so much fun. And part of the reason I got into talking and writing about software is because all too often we have made software not fun, and not turning people loose on interesting problems and letting them figure out with a small team how to rise to that challenge.
I have a little different perspective. And that is, if you're having trouble recruiting, you have to look at what is the work that you are asking people to sign up for. Why would anybody sign up for a job which was to do what somebody told them to do, to produce outputs that are decided by somebody else? That's essentially what software became in the 90s and 2000s. It's not something that makes a meaningful difference in the world. It is something that somebody out there tells the team, quote unquote, what to do. And deciding what to do is the fun part. It's not there are plenty of bright people around who can do anything. Once you've asked the right question, once you have the problem identified and coming up with solutions to challenging problems. But the problem is not to produce output. The problem is to produce outcomes, impacts, make a difference. And particularly younger folks in the world today are much more focused on making a difference. people who are just coming out of college these days are really focused on making a difference, particularly in the area of climate, because they will die from the impact of what we and our parents did over the last century. Literally. They're already dying from the heat. Maybe not yet in Calgary, but in many other parts of the world.
Yeah, Calgary's losing its great glaciers.
Yeah, I mean, the glaciers are going. So meaningful work, focusing on outcomes. And that is not something that is a software problem. It is not something that a Scrum team is going to solve. It's something that requires a reorientation of the entire organization to articulate and evolve the meaningful outcomes that they are pursuing. And the people that they want to hire are the ones for whom those outcomes are meaningful and important. And they will have no trouble if they identify the right outcomes.
Yeah, Tom, it's fascinating, Mary. If I can go back just a half step, if I could, because Tom, what you said was, we need to make certain that we indeed understand the problem. I think it was Kettering that once said, a problem well stated is a problem half solved.
Right.
I think there's something in this, though, isn't there, about a mindset? You speak of it, of course, as being a lean mindset in one of your groundbreaking books. How does that mindset, how do we apply that? How does that work across an organization? Tom, you mentioned it has to be pervasive in the organizations where it turns out to be successful. So
you started out talking about how should we work in the post-pandemic world. So let's go back to March of 2020. Everybody remembers March of 2020. And there were schools all over the world had to go home, start homeschooling, get professors online, get children online, figure everything out in, usually less than a week. And then the stores in our neighborhood had to learn how to do curbside pickup. It took most of them only 3 weeks. Now, there is an interesting problem that everybody can understand. They can tell when it's done, and it is not a software problem, but it sure as heck requires a ton of software. And so what people instinctively did was they put together small teams with the necessary people to get the store on curbside pickup, or get the college professors so that they knew how to use the tool, or make sure that the kids in kindergarten had laptops at their homes or whatever, and broadband access and lunches. And this stuff happened really fast, and teams were formed around an issue and thrown at the issue and said, solve this problem. And you'll know when it's solved because these kids will be learning at home, or because we will be working out of our home offices rather than our office here in downtown New York, or whatever. And everybody around the world figured out how to do that really, really fast. And not a single one of them was worried about a methodology of how to do it. They were putting together competent people and saying, here, this is your chunk of the problem, go figure it out. So we're not given solutions, they were given problems. And the team got to think about the problem. Now, if you pre-assign to a team a solution that you think will work, that's way less motivating than assigning to the team a problem where they can figure out if they have solved it or not. It's not, we think that these 5 software changes is going to get all the inventory lined up for our store, so that it's when Mary can drive to the store, can go online, find what is in the store, not have stockouts, somebody can pick it up and have it properly stored, and she can drive up and get it 2 hours later or whatever, then the problem is solved. And you guys, that's our description of the problem. You guys figure out the details. Now that's challenging. And it's this rising to a challenge that's important that invigorates people. I know people in software and people, they had to hire more people. So there had to be HR folks involved. There had to be inventory people involved. There had to be all kinds of, I know that every one of them spent hours upon hours, not 40 hours a week, and I'm going home, figuring out how to get that thing going and not really resting until it was going. because they knew what they were trying to accomplish and why. And they knew that they could tell when they were making progress. They could tell when they were done. And every one of them stuck with it because it mattered. Now, if you can create that environment, you will have no trouble recruiting people. But how do you create that environment? Well, first of all, your team is not a software team. Let's just banish the idea of a software team. Okay, your team has to be a team that is given a challenge and you can tell when the challenge has been met. The team has to have some sort of leadership. Somebody has to figure out stuff, but they should have a problem that's big enough that only a few people can work together to solve my chunk of the problem. Now, in software, the underlying technologies that allow that to happen are the ability to sort software problems out from other problems. But also, if you think about how do I do curbside pickup, you can do it in steps. You can just have a way for me to call a restaurant and order off a menu that's online. You can then put in online ordering. You eventually can even put in a GPS tracker that tells when I'm coming. You can, over the year, add features upon features. But the very first thing you have to do is make sure that I can order from that store. So the team is not given a solution. It's given a challenge. So it's not a team that's just software. It's a team that has the necessary people to solve a problem, an interesting, challenging, important problem. And if there are 5 such problems and 5 teams are working together, there is a simple way to coordinate, but not too tightly, because teams that get too big can't operate fast anymore. But a simple way to figure out who's doing what and when each piece is done and how it works with other pieces. If you take a look at what Amazon was doing 20 years ago in the early 2000s, they were taking a massive monolith and breaking it up so that they could put together teams like I just described and give them customer-focused problems that I just described. Or maybe their teams were sitting in a pipeline and they had a piece of the pipeline and an upstream and downstream customer. And those relatively small teams were able to take a big monolith, and over about 3 years, they were able to divide it up into what really small teams were capable of doing by themselves. And the team was just given the problem. They were given ops people, they were given technical people, they were given a business leader, generally speaking, something like that. Those teams eventually turned into figuring out how to do the basics of a cloud, which they then introduced in 2006. And today, they still work in AWS in relatively small teams, but they're not into the small anymore. They basically say that they did a lot of work and they discovered that so small is great for software, but not necessarily for some other problems. But what always works is the most successful teams, and by the way, you can find this in the book called Working Backwards. Okay, from, I forget the leaders, but it's called Working Backwards. It's a couple of Amazon executives just walking through their 10-year transition process from 2000 to 2010. And so they finally discovered that the kind of teams that work the best, that are most successful, are the ones that have what they call a single-threaded leader, who then gathers together a single-threaded team. Single-threaded means the leader does one and only one thing, for which they are completely responsible. And they have the necessary both charter to hire a team and capability to lead that team to accomplish that thing that they're supposed to attack. Both the leader and the team members have nothing else to do but solve that problem. You can bet that when the pandemic came and there was a team at, say, the University of whatever nearby you that was supposed to get all the professors teaching online, that they had nothing else to do but that. So what Amazon has discovered is that small teams are good and important, and you can't have them too big, but the thing that really matters is to have them focused on doing one thing only, and be able to tell when they're accomplishing it. So I go into work, And I know that when I come in, there's this challenge awaiting me that we've been trying to figure out together, the 10 of us or whatever, maybe 20, maybe 5, for the last several weeks. And we're making progress, and I get to make some more progress on the problem. And I will be able to tell when I'm doing well, because this customer will be happy or will be able to do these additional things. And if we start thinking about setting teams up like that, which, you know, violates a few of the principles of some of the methodologies, but does not violate the fundamental engineering principles that are behind the software or any other kind of engineering discipline. So that's the way I visualize it.
I mean, I think it's a good example of when the chips are down and people's livelihoods and survival is at stake.
Yeah.
People become agile, lean, they throw the processes out of the old ways of doing things. It's just, yeah.
In normal times, this is impossible for most organizations.
Exactly. It's
the reason it's impossible is fairly easy to see. It's their metrics. They focus on productivity. They focus on resource utilization. And those focuses force you into optimization and using expensive resources only for the things that they are optimum for. And this results in so many handoffs, so much delay that nothing ever gets done. If your metric is based on the outputs of each precious resource and your utilization, you will never make the kind of change that we're describing here. You have to focus on the outcomes, on the impacts that you need to have. And that's also how you retain the people, is by enabling them to make a real difference in something that they care about.
So I totally agree that, you know, people working on things that they care about, that matter, and is really important. Not every company necessarily has things that are outwardly super interesting to work on, and so sometimes it comes down to marketing that in a better way to the community that you're trying to attract.
So wait a minute, could you? I'm going to challenge that statement. Not every company has stuff that can be super interesting to people. Then I'm not sure I agree.
Then why do they exist?
Yeah, why do they exist? Every company has something that they're trying to do. They're just not passing that something that they're trying to do down to the engineers on the ground. They're not allowing the engineers on the ground to figure out how to do it. Contrast that to my my granddaughter's boyfriend, who gets to design a whole solar field. You know, we're trying to put solar on our roof, and we talk to him and he says, well, I can do fields, but I don't think I can do roofs yet. But he gets a whole field and says, here, figure it out, figure out how to put. So he could have been interested in a lot of stuff, but that's where he happened to be ended up zeroing in on. So there's an awful lot of stuff that companies do. There are some people in the company that are enthusiastic about that. And if you could tie the people who are enthusiastic about accomplishing something and what they know about what it'll look like when it's accomplished to the people that are going to work with them to make it happen, I think you could have a very interesting environment in most companies. But the structure of companies is completely opposite of that most times.
I think I agree with you. I think it's also partly companies are not necessarily always great at communicating what is interesting about their business.
Yeah.
Right, which is a huge issue. And they kind of get overshadowed by the kind of, you know, what's hot right now. Anything in sort of healthcare is often easy to get people excited about. The environment, all those sort of things. But there's so many industries where they maybe appear to be dull and sort of from the outside, but actually if you can get into the inside and really understand what's going on, and people believe it internally that what they are working on is interesting, then they can sell that.
That's right. And what people are going to do, especially, I'm going to make a generalization, software engineers are going to want to do something that's interesting and challenging. And if you don't give them something that's interesting and challenging, they will find something that's interesting and challenging. And it will be, you know, the latest technology out there and see how it works or something like that. But, you know, if I'm trying to get a pandemic related app up in, 3 days. I don't have time to worry about the latest technology. All I have time to worry about is getting it up so that the customer's problem is solved, and that's fun. And so you need to create a way to think about people love to be challenged, and creating a challenge with the output, the outcome that the company needs being the thing that people are challenged to achieve, rather than having 3 or 4 or 5 layers in between the challenge and the people doing it. And the challenge doesn't get transmitted down. Somebody way over on the side gets to decide how to address the challenge, rather than the engineers on the ground getting to address the challenge.
There's one thing that we're using a word wrong, and that is we're not about solving problems. One of the things from the lean world is that you don't solve problems, you mitigate them. You address them, but as soon as you make a change, the context of the problem changes and the problem itself changes. There's no way to solve the problem, but you can make it better. You can make improvements in the area that the problem is affecting. So it's not something that you achieve a solution. It's something where you make the world better, and then you see what needs to be done next.
That reminds me of way back when I was a young engineer bringing process controls to plants, and software was really early, and we were in an engineering research area in 3M, and the senior vice president said, or maybe it was my boss, but anyway, somebody senior in my organization said to us, made sure, whatever technology you bring to the plant is going to change the problem that you're trying to solve. So you have to bring something to solve the problem, but then you have to go there and discover what problems that creates and worry about those problems too, and continually figure out how the problem evolves as the technology to address it evolves. That was our job as engineers. I was like a really junior engineer, but that was what we were chartered to do. Go to the plant and understand how your software is impacting the ability of the people who are expected to use it to do their job, and constantly change what it is that you're trying to deliver so that you continually support them in their job. And there was no end.
So looking at it, Mary, more like it's a system,
constant problem. What?
So more looking at it, Mary, as though it's the system that it is, right? It's a broader context.
Yep.
I have a question for you. I'm also fascinated. I mean, we all know that elements of lean certainly speak towards the elimination of waste, and that just keeps changing. Again, like the system itself, that changes. How does this elimination of waste work nowadays? Where do you think that?
So I would just substitute a different word. All right, let's call it friction. Okay, just forget waste. It's not a good translation of Muda anyway, and use friction. And think about, how do I eliminate friction in my process? Now, you have to have some friction, okay? Because if I don't have friction on my driveway, because we've just had an ice storm, I can't walk to the mailbox. I can't drive up it. So there has to be a little bit of friction. Otherwise, people are just going to scoot out, and anybody that's in snow country like you guys gets it. So, but friction is generally stuff you don't want, whether it's driving a car or whether it's responding to a customer problem or something like that. What creates friction? What slows stuff down? And there is a point at which friction is necessary. So we'll buy that because we think about our driveway, right? And sometimes there's a little sand, but it doesn't need very much. And by and large, we're trying to eliminate friction in our process, and friction caused by what we do, our product, in the customer's life. So you look for how the friction, if you're looking at customers, you say, well, what creates friction for them? And then you look at how you deliver that, and you say, what creates friction in the sequence of getting that to them so that their lives are better. And if you look for friction, it's a good word because it isn't really bad. It's just there, but it can be reduced. Generally speaking, it can be reduced a lot. And there are weird things that cause friction, like too much traffic on a highway causes too much friction because the cars are too close, so there has to be spaces. and stuff like that. So if you just substitute that word, I think you can look at our processes, our methodologies, and we can look at our customers and say, where's the friction? For instance, when people were doing like website development, they looked at when somebody's on my website trying to buy something, where's the friction? The friction is in the user experience. The friction is in the friction in the user experience is exactly what you don't want. You want it completely seamless. There's friction in the process of, say you add a shipping charge and all of a sudden lots of people say, oh, I'm not paying it and depart. That shipping charge caused friction in the buying process. So you're looking for sources of friction and what you can do about them. Does that make sense?
Absolutely.
Well, some friction I'm seeing right now is organizations who are reluctant to make decisions about even around workforce planning, because they're waiting for the next health order, or they're waiting to know all of the facts, or they're waiting to, figure out what the next, business move needs to be in order to keep the lights on with the business. And so,
yeah, well, that's valid.
Yeah, except that
Okay.
on the employee side, there's friction because, many people are going like, what's my workplace going to decide, and how can I, and I need to make decisions around my life and whether I'm going to continue working here and things like that. And so I wonder, just, from your perspectives and from all the companies that you've seen, I'm seeing a little bit of analysis paralysis. I'm seeing some people who are just hesitating and potentially at the risk of losing some of their great people.
Okay, so if you're a great software engineer or, test engineer or whatever, and you have an organization that doesn't think about you when they're thinking about business decisions, doesn't communicate to you what their issues are, what their problems are, when they can expect something new and different. If you have an organization that doesn't do that, you don't have to stay there. So if your problem is going to be recruiting and retaining, if that's something that you're going to worry about, you have to worry about communicating your issues and problems to the people you're trying to retain, or they don't have any trouble finding another job. That's the reality, not just in software, but in an awful lot of things. But let's just take software engineers. There's no problem finding another more interesting, more challenging job. So if you can't make your job such that, yes, we have these worries and yes, we have these fears, but here's the deal, guys. If you can't communicate that to your software engineers, then you can expect to lose them. And that's, don't talk to me about retention.
Mary, I have a question around, all the great things that people instinctively did when the pandemic hit, for example, where they just had to survive and they had to get their businesses reorganized, and it all happened very, very quickly, and it all happened on a global scale too, which was fascinating because every customer was going through the exact same thing. So suddenly their potential client base went from, this big to like this big, and if they crack the code, they hit a home run. And that's why we've seen some explosive growth with some companies that actually figured it out. Do you think there's a danger that people unaware how instinctively agile and lean they can be, and that when they now have the option to go back to the traditional workplace, I would say it's never going to be the same, but I think some people are itching to get back to the office, that they're going to lose all the great learnings they had and what they achieved in those sort of, what they've achieved over the last 18 months. That's going to get lost, and we're going to...
Well, we're talking about smart people, aren't we?
Well, yeah, but I mean smart people still often go back to their comfort zone and don't necessarily recognize what they have achieved when their hands were forced, or when their hands were tied and they were forced into a corner.
I think that Canada probably has the same phenomena that we do in the US, the Great Resignation.
Yeah, for sure.
Just resigning is not confined to technical fields. It's everywhere. In fact, the worse people are treated, the less they're paid, the less they are inclined to go back to the way it was. You can't hire somebody to work in a restaurant. You can't hire somebody to clerk a store. Hours are having to be cut.
Drive buses. Can't get enough school bus drivers to open our schools. It's a fact.
So it's not a software field problem. It is a structure of the way people think about how organizations should be run. And that cannot go back to the way it used to be. It cannot. People will not tolerate it. The people who are going to come back to work are the ones that see a difference, that see that the world is not the way it used to be.
Yeah, well, I think you're right. Ultimately, companies will be forced to change and continue to change and evolve based on the workforce and what the workforce is saying to them.
The ones that listen. Okay.
Yeah, the ones that don't listen will fail ultimately.
Exactly. That, and you know, I've always had not that much sympathy for the companies that are ready to listen to what makes sense. But if you care about having good employees that do interesting things, because where else does the company get to move forward except on the intelligence of its employees? And the companies that are able to leverage to the max the intelligence of their employees are the ones that do the best, always. And so if you can figure out how to free up your employees to be smart and to do interesting things in the name of the objective of your business, then you are going to be much more successful than if you just have a few key people making those kinds of decisions. And that does not matter what kind of business that you're in. If you can figure out how to leverage the intelligence of your people, your company can be more successful. We have a warehouse company called Costco. Is there much of a Costco in Canada?
We
And
have Costco.
You know what? They're just not having trouble hiring people. They have lines of people that would, you know, give their eye teeth to work in that store because they've always treated employees extremely well and given them great challenges and excellent salary and really good benefits. But it's not just salary and benefits that attract people. It's the challenge of the job, the interesting things that they get to do, even where large amounts of it are repetitive. I don't know about your Costco, but I can just tell that the people are forever trying to solve problems and do things better and sort through issues, and they get to do that, and they own areas of the store, so they like it. Now, if a big warehouse shopping store can have people dying to work for them, surely whatever company that is trying to look for software engineers can make the job challenging. It's possible. And if you don't, then it's much more important not to look for a methodology of how to do that, but look for a way to think about getting inside the minds of the people that you're trying to attract and think about what it is that they're going to find interesting and challenging and something that will keep and sticky. Okay. And when you can create the job around that instead of around your preconceived notion of how people like rewards and that sort of thing, you know, your incentive pay systems and all that, you can throw that out and start thinking about what really attracts and retains people and figure out how to have the right kind of structure to make that happen, then you'll do much better. So again, let's go back to AWS. They have amazing thousands upon thousands of teams or of software engineers on teams. And they don't have much trouble adding teams to add more software services every year. I have never seen a company put more enterprise capable software on the market year after year after year after year, starting in 2012 than AWS. How do they do that? Okay. And you know, even Amazon, AWS has challenged hiring people, but they have been able to constantly put new enterprise grade software that everybody trusts on the market every single year. There's whole tons of new stuff and it just keeps growing. There's a lot of software engineers behind that. And if you read that book, Working Backwards, you can understand how they think about how to structure those software teams. They create small, focused teams, not trying to maximize resources, but trying to maximize customer happiness, customer satisfaction, and take and focus a team on a very pinpoint piece of customer happiness and say, make that customer happy. And you guys in this small team get to figure that out all by yourself. And here's how you're going to know that you're successful. And that's what we're going to be looking for. And it's going to be a customer focused success metrics, or 2 or 3. And go for it. And they start with a leader, various types of leaders that are capable of leading a group of people to head out and do something with that challenge. And that's their methodology. If you want to look for a methodology, look at Amazon's Working Backwards methodology.
Interesting. This idea of tapping into this collective intelligence that exists within it by sharing the problems, right?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
We solve it together, not alone.
And do you
Now
think
you have to structure the problems small enough.
Just where I was going to go.
Big problems are small, segregated pieces. So a good model for that is to look at SpaceX. Okay. So SpaceX, everybody knows if you work for SpaceX, or if you don't, that you're trying to get to the moon, right? And actually Mars. What?
Mars.
Trying to get Mars. But basically you're worried about the next test launch, pretty much. Because it takes a lot of years to actually have a rocket that you can shoot up. But back when they were, I don't know if you've ever seen the video of all the times that they crashed their boosters as they were testing them. Okay, so is that good or bad? It's solid engineering, because what they did was they said, we are going to have a launch on whatever, February 6th, 2018, you name it, and it's going to launch. That's our window. That's what we got. And here are all of the teams and sub-teams, and they divide the thing up by its components, the booster rocket. It has different components, and each component has a team and a set of sub-teams, and then they divide each component up into subcomponents. And every single subcomponent team knows that when the launch is and what they have to do to make their piece of that launch work. And they have to put their best shot towards what's going to make it work. And there's no moving the deadline. It ain't going to move, right? Maybe bad weather, but that's it. So, so the deadline's coming, and you have to have something that works. It's just like during the pandemic. By this weekend, everybody's going to be home, like it or not. So do your best shot at figuring out how to get them home. That's what they have every single time that they do something. They have a launch date with a deadline. And then each team knows their little piece in the big thing, but the architecture is such that each team can make independent decisions about their piece. And sometimes you have to coordinate with your whole subcomponent teams, but generally speaking, you just have your piece, and you know what your piece needs to do, and you know who the suppliers to your piece are, and they know what you need. And it's your job to make that all clear, but your job is also to know, in the overall scheme of things, where does your piece fit in making it successful? And should that rocket crash, like it did a lot of times, you also know that you have 24 hours before Elon Musk calls and says, what went wrong, what caused it, and how are you going to make sure it never happens again? 24 hours, that's it, and you better have an answer. He didn't say, shame on you for crashing it. He says, you better tell me how it's never going to happen again. Otherwise, you die, okay? So things never happen again. And they have to instrument like crazy. You see all these videos on SpaceX. Those videos aren't there for fun. They're there because every single team knows that they have 24 hours to analyze any kind of defect. And so they put in all those videos by themselves without anybody telling them to, because otherwise they couldn't figure out when it crashes what goes wrong. And so lots and lots of software, lots and lots of hardware, but the teams are focused on my piece in the big picture, my upstream suppliers, my downstream customers, and how I fit in the whole launch and when the deadline is. And usually speaking, they're not going to have one approach to the launch. They're going to have 3 options, you know, good, better, best, and whichever one's actually ready on launch date, they're going to put out there. You know, just like in the US, we had 5 or 6 different vaccination options. funded them all. Didn't say, oh, what a waste. We should just try one. And if that doesn't work, try the next. Nope. Matter of life and death. You try 5, right? And it's the same when there's a hard deadline and it has to go. You don't try one thing. You try 5 or 3 or whatever. One for sure, you're quite positive is going to work. One is a moonshot. And because you have that hard deadline, you have to make sure that you have a few things that are going to work against that deadline. So that's how teams coordinate across SpaceX. They coordinate by launch date. And the next launch date is never more than, say, 3 months away. So they're all coordinating towards an event that's like approximately 3 months away or less. And everybody knows that that thing is going to happen. And it takes massive numbers of software engineers and hardware engineers and all those other kinds of engineers. And it gets them working together without too much communication getting in the way. The architecture allows them to do independent things. The integrating events, the launch dates, cause them to have to work together.
There are two important aspects. One aspect that's critical is, of course, that it works eventually. But in order to get there, the other aspect is even more important, and that is you design the way you work. You design your stuff so that you learn as quickly as possible whether your choice is a good one or where it needs to be improved. And that, I think, is a lesson that is directly transferable to products that include software. You have to design the work so that you learn as quickly as possible whether the choices you've made so far are effective in achieving the outcome you're after, or whether they need to be tailored because your design was inadequate, because the context was inadequate, because what you've done so far changes the situation that you're addressing. So learning, the feedback that you get has to be built in as a first order objective.
Quick
Yeah,
question.
not an afterthought, Tom.
Yeah. One last thing, because I know we have some people that want to jump into the chat. We've got lots of questions here, but I had one last question for you, and that is, I think some companies, when they talk about lean and agile, maybe it's their engineering team that uses it. Maybe it's another group that uses it. But, we talk about a mindset, and we should talk. Do you think we should talk about that across the entire organization, from the executives all the way down? Like you look at like an Elon Musk, for example, that's how he thinks, and he runs his company that way. It's not
he's like the engineer's engineer.
Right, which is why it's successful. Like most things in life, if it comes from the top and they believe in it, then it will happen. So is that something that is super important to actually make this work, that the founders, the executives, everybody buys into this concept?
Well, yes. Bezos is the same. He bought into, in fact, forced his company to go to small independent teams because he had this passionate belief that you can't actually get to any significant size. You can't scale unless you have large numbers of independent agents making independent decisions. So notably at Amazon, there is no standard process of any type. Okay, a team can use whatever process they want. They have to hit objectives that are outcome-based objectives that they've agreed to do when they work on something. But there's a really interesting 2015 talk by somebody on Amazon who was talking about how they went through their transition. And I can find that out and put it in the chat later, the name of the person. But
yeah, that'd be great.
But his basic point was that that they had to design a process, that they had to design a structure that worked with no team being required to follow any particular process, because that was the game. Teams were to be independent, and so nobody was going to tell them how to run their processes. They were only going to tell them what outcomes that the team was supposed to achieve from a customer perspective. And that's a ton of software they have out there that they're doing that kind of challenge with. It's hard to say that you have a piece of equipment or a software environment that is too big to do this kind of stuff if you take a look at AWS and SpaceX. Okay, but the way that they coordinate is not the way that most people think about coordinating across teams. In big hardware stuff, which is what I did hardware automation, you always coordinate with event tests, scheduled tests across a subcomponent, subset of the system, and you do it no more than 3 months apart. With Amazon, they basically have a way to understand the impact of any piece on customers. I'm not quite sure how because they have a basic pipeline of the way stuff goes through, but they're all chartered to make the customer's life better. And somehow or other, they create metrics where they can visualize in a customer sense how that team is doing. And so the team is looking for customer results. Now, I've read another book about Think Like Amazon, which talks about how they create objectives for teams that are customer focused, very high level customer focused objectives. And then the teams figure out how in their context of what they're supposed to do, they can hit that high level customer objective. Similar to how SpaceX says, we're going to launch on, June 7th, and we better not crash. And so I'm not sure that the concept of scaling is a concept that is hard, but it's not something that you gather everybody and have discussions. It's not something that you worry about taking a process that works at this scale and goes to another scale. It is much more something that thinks about, how do I take what I'm trying to achieve and make sure that we check very regularly how it's coming along against customer expectations.
So there's a question in the chat here that says, isn't there a risk of creating several processes, reinventing process, none of which are necessarily optimized or better, by just putting people on teams and telling them to solve interesting problems?
Well, if AWS can do it, why would it be a risk?
So it says, I guess.
Yeah, sure, there's a risk, but why do you need just one process? Where did you get the idea that a single process is a good thing? That doesn't make sense. You start with a given. I've seen this for decades. Start with a given that we should have one process and we should all follow it. And I'm thinking, wrong. Why would that be a good idea? We're just creating automatons. Why don't we give teams objectives and let them figure out their own process? And yes, what if their process isn't optimal? Who cares? Why is that important? Why are we trying to get the optimal process? Why is there one best way? We create one best way, but do we create one best result? You can't have both.
An executive at a local company 25 years ago told me why they want one process. It's fungibility, so that they can treat their people as resources and move them around and have them be immediately effective no matter what project they're assigned to. Did it work? No.
Well, they were
fungible. But it's still the way that people were thinking 25 years ago. If people are still thinking that way, well.
Yeah, I really think it's time to rethink the concept that there is such a thing as one optimal process.
To get away from Taylorism, right?
Yeah, about time.
There's one more question in the chat here. What would be a set of good first steps to move towards your methods? Like 3 steps, like say in the next few months, as people are thinking about.
Well, it depends upon where the person is sitting in the organization.
Pardon me?
It depends upon where this person is sitting in the organization. A senior executive would have a whole different set of steps than, a software engineer. So that's kind of hard to say. But the very first thing to do is to look at your architecture of the product you're trying to make. Is that architecture decoupled enough that relatively small pieces can be worked upon by really truly independently separate teams? That's where Amazon started out in 2001, and it took them 4 years to make their architecture such that independent small teams could work on it. If you have a big monolithic architecture, you are not going to be able to have separable teams. You can do all the stuff you want and people and process, but if you have an architecture that ain't going to support having relatively small teams be able to make their own independent decisions, the rest is like, it's not going to work. So I would say looking at the structure and architecture of the thing that you're building is the first thing. And if you're way up there, you need to get some really good architects to talk to. And if you're down at engineering, you need to find some really good architects to discuss this with. And then you need to make sure that you're thinking architecturally about how you're going to take and create environments in which relatively small, completely focused teams can be put together to work on things. But if you don't have a structure that allows the organization to look like that, then you can't change your organization. Changing your organization without even thinking about an architectural structure of what it is you're trying to build is going to be a useless exercise.
You know,
It's turtles all the way down.
One thing, sorry, Tom, carry on.
It's turtles all the way down. It's architecture all the way down. There's the software architecture. There is the operations architecture. There is the organization's architecture. How do you divide the problem and define the relationship among the parts at an organization level? There's a market architecture. How do you fit into the market with suppliers and consumers and customers? All of these are architectural problems about how you divide things up and how the different parts relate to each other. The problem is having an excellent architecture, not suboptimizing each of the pieces. We've gotten caught up in suboptimizing the pieces, and we've forgotten to evolve the structure of all of the levels of architecture. So if you're at a top level, you need to focus on one kind of architecture. If you are at a industry level, industry organization, you might have to structure the architecture of the market, evolve it. If you're at a developer level, you focus on the architecture of the things that you touch every day to make them more and more maintainable, more and more adaptable, separable. So it's all architecture.
You know,
all the way down.
One of the things I see just from the companies we recruit for, because quite often we work with companies that are at a point where they're now 30 people, they've got a product, it's actually being, you know, it's got a place in the market, it's growing, they've got some VC funding now, and it's kind of go time. And they have very junior teams that they've staffed their companies around, which is partly an affordability issue around it's hard for them to find and attract and afford top-end talent. So they tend to bring in a lot of more sort of junior intermediate resources that quickly kind of.
And how do they do that? How do they hire them?
What's that?
How do they hire? How do they recruit and hire?
I mean, they would do it through, you know, the universities in the area. They would do it through
But
the traditional methods.
Okay, say I'm a software engineer and I'm talking to somebody at that company. Would I be talking to my potential boss?
Oh yeah, you're more likely to talk to the team lead or the CIO, the original founder, or one of the, because when companies are small, they'll typically be interviewed by the CTO or the CIO.
Okay, but remember, when I go to work there, I want to know what my work environment is going to look like and who's leading. What I'm talking about is the way that Amazon describes their working backward process. The senior people appoint a team lead, and the team lead recruits the team and puts together the team. Is that how it would work?
Yeah, that would be typically how it would work. The challenge, though, is I think it's the level of people that they can bring into an organization in the early stages. Because there's a cost. There's a cost issue, and the ability to actually compete with, you know, the big companies like the Amazons, like the Facebooks, like the Twitters of the world. It's really hard for these startups and smaller companies to attract the talent they need. And so when they get to a certain size, their architecture is not actually able to sustain their growth and scalability. And that's where they run into challenges. We see it all the time. Companies are saying we need more maturity in our team because we've got a lot of junior talent that has moved up the ranks quickly. There's now, you know, a manager or a team lead, and they've got 4 years experience. Right, and that's the supply issue, and it's also the.
So how do they deal with that?
Well, then they run into this challenge of they got to a point where they really have something, but the scalability of the product or the architecture is a challenge. So either then they'll look at a different, and they'll want to rewrite the technology or rewrite the architecture in a new technology, let's say. Like Ruby or Rails has always been a challenge to, as companies try to scale. So they look at new technologies that are out there, languages that are going to help them do that. But often it's a rewrite. And so, you suddenly find companies after 2 to 3 years in, and now they're looking to rewrite their architecture.
Whoa, but there's no benefit to that.
Right. But we see that happening. Michael, do you have a comment on that?
Well, go ahead.
No, please, Mary.
The changing architecture as the scale of the problem that they're addressing changes is right. It's not a defect. The best way of approaching a small problem is with a certain architecture. When the problem gets more complex, when you have to multiply the instances of the various services and so forth, you need a different architecture. Almost everyone starts out with some kind of a monolith. This gets broken up as they go along. The thing is that a rewrite, throwing everything out and starting all over again, is how most organizations, small organizations, die.
So,
because it's not viable all by itself. You have to be able to evolve from where you start, the right place to start, to a better place as you grow.
So every story I've heard of, we were this size and we got to be that size and we got there fast, goes sort of like this. We found the biggest bottleneck and we took this many people and we threw them at that bottleneck. And then we found the next bottleneck and we took this group of people and we threw them and while that group was working in the bottleneck, they pulled it off and put it in the shape that we wanted our new architecture. And then the next group that took the next big problem, took that problem, and they pulled it off and they put it in the shape for the future. And, we could even take fairly junior people because we gave them just like, there's one problem. There's not a big, there is a vision of where we want to go and where we need to be. And there is here's where we are. And the very first team to do the very first one is usually a fairly sophisticated team, maybe with some technical consulting and stuff like that. But after they create a path to go from this chunk to make it work way better over here, and they take one chunk at a time. And after they get a path to show teams, if you want to go from here to here, here's the 5 steps that'll get you there. Then they create this path, and then all of a sudden you can start forming a lot of teams on different chunks of your big system and move it over. And every story I've heard about success, that's the way the story goes.
Well, it's fascinating, Mary, isn't it? The idea that it's a never-ending problem. Certainly fits with reality, doesn't it?
Yes.
I think, Mary, we probably have to take a look at time and maybe I'll pass it over to Candance to wrap us up.
Sure. So just final comments, Mary and Tom. What do organizations need to do in order to thrive in the next few months and beyond, from your perspective?
Continuous refactoring of their architecture, of their applications, of their organizational structure. Keep making things better based on the feedback you get that you've structured what you're doing to generate.
Continue to evolve, eh?
I think companies need to think really hard about how to leverage the smart, intelligent people that they have now and ways to allow those people to use all of their, bring their whole selves to work and leverage all of their intelligence against a challenge that they believe in. And if you can structure work like that, you will grow a lot faster than if you think just a few people can orchestrate it.
Mary and Tom, Michael, Alistair, thanks so much for showing up to this I had an idea that this might be awesome, and I think I was right. This has been a rich conversation, and I just look forward to continuing to learn from the two of you. And thank you so much for your generosity with your of thought, for your leadership, for your just the way that you bring the past to help us understand the future and help us to see the future. And the future is pretty exciting, I think. And just I think on behalf of everyone here, I just want to express sincere gratitude for you coming and spending this time with us today.
Thank you very much, everybody.
Thanks, everybody. Have a wonderful day.
Thanks, Mary. Thanks, Tom.
Hey, thanks, everybody.
Thanks very much.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.